A single penny vanished from a quarterly report, and single father Nolan Pierce was fired by CEO Evelyn Blackwood in front of the entire executive board. To everyone watching, it looked like a tired accountant's rounding error, the kind of clerical slip that happens when someone has been staring at numbers too long. But Nolan understood something the others did not. The system never lost a penny by accident. It only left one behind when someone was concealing something far larger. That night, he traced the discrepancy through thousands of freight invoices and discovered a trail protecting a $700 million theft. Stay with this story to the end. Nolan proved the smallest number in the room can bring down the largest lie. 3 days before Blackwood Meridian was scheduled to release its quarterly financial filing to global markets, Nolan Pierce sat alone at his workstation on the 31st floor and noticed something that should not have existed. The consolidated global ledger, the master account that absorbed every transaction processed by the world's fourth largest logistic conglomerate, was off by precisely 1 cent. And unlike every other anomaly Nolan had encountered in 13 years of Treasury reconciliation, this one had appeared after the system had already confirmed a clean balance. Every sub-account had closed correctly, every verification pass had returned 0 variance, and yet the aggregate total now carried a discrepancy that had not been there when the final confirmation printed at midnight. Nolan was not a man who dismissed small numbers. He had built a quiet reputation for catching the patterns that everyone else classified as noise, and in that time he had learned one thing with absolute consistency. A healthy ledger did not spontaneously develop gaps. It only appeared to when something had been carefully introduced to make a gap look inevitable. He pulled the transaction log, sorted by timestamp, and located the precise moment the imbalance had materialized. It had entered the ledger in the 60-second window after the system issued its own 0 variance confirmation, with no operator account, no authorization code, and no originating user identity, only a payment instruction attributed to a carrier named Coastal Bridge Transport, a freight company whose operating license had been voluntarily surrendered 26 months earlier. The record of a dead company moving money through a live ledger was not a rounding artifact. It was an answer waiting to be questioned. Nolan documented the anomaly in a formal internal memo and sent it up the chain before the morning shift change, not because he believed 1 cent threatened a conglomerate processing $43 billion annually, but because an entry with no origin in a system that required origin codes for every transaction was a structural impossibility that demanded an explanation. His supervisor forwarded the memo to CFO Conrad Whitmore's office with a suggestion that the discrepancy be manually adjusted to clear before the filing deadline, and Conrad's response arrived within the hour. The imbalance was a legacy artifact from a currency conversion rounding protocol. It had appeared in prior quarters without consequence, and Nolan should apply the standard correction and move forward. Conrad was a measured, courtly man who had occupied the CFO seat for 7 years with a public record unblemished by controversy, and his explanation was delivered with the calm authority of someone who had prepared it in advance. Nolan called Conrad's office directly and said he could not authorize a manual override because doing so would sever the audit trail connecting the ledger entry to its originating transaction, and the originating transaction, whatever it actually was, had arrived from an account that the company's own records showed as permanently closed. Conrad told him, with the patient evenness of someone explaining a decision that had already been made, that the filing window closed in 72 hours and that hundreds of professionals across every division had already confirmed their sections. Nolan understood the weight of that institutional momentum. He ran a secondary query anyway, pulling every payment attributed to the Coastal Bridge Transport vendor code going back to the date the company had ceased operations and the results populated his screen with 314 separate line items, each one small, each one labeled Port Adjustment Fee. Each one processed in the final minutes of a monthly cycle when transaction volume was highest and individual scrutiny lowest, and each one carrying the same impossible attribute: no operator, no purchase order, no originating contract number. The pattern was not accidental. It was architectural. He sent a second memo, this one addressed directly to CEO Evelyn Blackwood, requesting a hold on the filing and attaching the full transaction log alongside a timeline that placed the first anomalous coastal bridge entry exactly 1 week after Conrad Whitmore's appointment as CFO. Evelyn Blackwood received the memo at 6:47 in the morning while she was already in the building, preparing for a briefing with the investment bank overseeing Blackwood Meridian's $4 billion bond issuance, the centerpiece of her 5-year restructuring plan and the clearest signal yet that the fourth-generation heir could run a global enterprise on capability rather than lineage. Any delay in the quarterly filing would trigger a mandatory disclosure event, giving analysts exactly the opening they had been positioned to exploit. And that calculus was already running in her mind when she forwarded Nolan's memo to Conrad and convened an emergency finance committee session at 8 o'clock. Conrad arrived with a full presentation. He explained the currency rounding protocol in technical detail, walked through the legacy data dictionary entry that classified the coastal bridge code as an approved batch identifier, and then presented something Nolan had not anticipated: a system access report showing that the last account to query the coastal bridge payment records before the discrepancy appeared had been Nolan's own workstation login, timestamped at 11:53 the previous evening. The implication was not stated directly, but it did not need to be. Conrad suggested that Nolan's query into the legacy records may have inadvertently triggered a reconciliation conflict, and that the responsible course was to apply the standard correction, complete the filing, and review the access protocols afterward. Nolan asked for the floor and received it. He explained that his session had used read-only query commands and had not modified any values, that the access report would confirm this if the committee pulled the server-side write log, and that the discrepancy timestamp fell outside his session window by 11 minutes. Conrad said pulling the write log would require IT to suspend normal operations for several hours, which the filing deadline made impossible. Evelyn looked across the table at a man with 13 years of unblemished service and a CFO who had just explained why verifying that service would take too long, and she made the only choice the deadline permitted her to make. She gave Nolan a final option: apply the correction, sign the confirmation as a matter of procedural compliance, and allow the audit flag to accompany the filing for post-submission review. Nolan said he could not sign a document he could not verify, because his signature would attach his name to whatever the underlying transactions had been designed to conceal, and he would not accept that exposure regardless of the timeline or the amount at stake. Conrad immediately moved to recommend termination for failure to comply with a direct procedural instruction, unauthorized access of legacy vendor data, and deliberate delay of a time-sensitive regulatory filing. 3 committee members seconded the motion before Nolan had risen from his chair. Evelyn approved the termination effective immediately, and the room went still in the way that rooms do when something irreversible has just been formally ratified. The floor watched Nolan pack a single cardboard box, 1 photograph of his daughter, a spare calculator, a worn notepad, and carry it to the elevator with the unhurried composure of a man who has already decided his next step. Before he reached the lobby exit, he stopped at a hall printer, entered a manual retrieval command from memory, and collected a single page from the output tray. A transaction record bearing the identifier NDP001. He folded the page without looking at it and placed it in his jacket pocket. That evening, his severance transfer arrived in his personal account, the amount calculated to the cent according to his employment contract, and it was short by exactly 1 cent. Nolan looked at the bank notification for a long time before the significance settled fully. The 1 cent shortfall in his severance payment was not a payroll rounding error. It was the same signature, the same automated marker that had appeared in the Coastal Bridge records, which meant the program generating the discrepancy was not embedded in a departmental freight reconciliation module. It was running at the infrastructure level, touching every outbound payment the company produced, flagging each one as it cleared. A program operating at that depth, with that consistency, had not been installed by a junior programmer filling a ledger gap. Someone had built it deliberately, maintained it carefully, and calibrated it to stay beneath every materiality threshold in the organization's compliance framework. Nolan did not sleep that night. He worked through the quarterly summaries he had downloaded before his access was revoked, isolating vendor codes that shared the same structural characteristics as Coastal Bridge: dormant registrations, port-adjacent service categories, payment records clustered at month-end when transaction density was highest. By 3 in the morning, he had identified 47 additional accounts matching the profile, and the aggregate value of payments flowing through them had already passed $200 million in the data he could see. He contacted Reed Calloway the following afternoon. Reed had left Blackwood Meridian 2 years earlier to run an independent security architecture practice and still held professional access to several financial infrastructure audit databases. He was cautious when Nolan called, not skeptical of Nolan's analysis, but aware that the company's legal team had already begun circulating the narrative that Nolan had compromised the payment system before his departure, and Reed had a business to protect. Nolan did not argue the framing. He showed Reed the severance notification and asked him to examine the payment routing record as a neutral party with no prior connection to the claim. Reed spent 40 minutes cross-referencing the gateway logs available through the public financial clearing database and found something Nolan had missed. The severance transfer had been processed simultaneously through 2 separate payment gateways. One had moved the actual funds correctly. The second had created a shadow record, a duplicate entry with the same reference number, but a value 1 cent lower, and the shadow record had been logged as the authoritative confirmation while the real transfer queued in a secondary reconciliation hold. The program was not extracting pennies. It was using a penny as a confirmation token, identical to the read receipt mechanism in secure message routing, except that each confirmed token corresponded to a much larger transaction being executed in a parallel network elsewhere in the system. Reed named the program Needlepoint, a single thread passing through millions of transactions without disturbing the surface of any one of them. Nolan's daughter Lena came home to find her father surrounded by annotated printouts and said nothing about the hour or the disorder. She set food beside his papers, sat with him for a while, and told him she had watched him give more careful attention to numbers than most people gave to anything, and if he believed a penny mattered, she did too. 3 days after his termination, a law firm representing Blackwood Meridian delivered a cease and desist letter warning that any use of proprietary data obtained during his employment would expose him to civil liability. The morning after that, a consulting firm he had never encountered sent a written offer, $500,000 for a confidentiality agreement, a release of all claims, and his written confirmation that the quarterly filing contained no irregularities. The offer expired in 48 hours. Nolan read it once and put it in the same drawer as the severance statement. Reed decoded the NDP prefix that same evening. It was not a transaction category code. NDP stood for Network Distribution Pass, an internal status flag indicating that an extraction cycle had completed and the destination accounts had been credited. Every NDP code carried a sequential number. NDP 001 had been the first. Evelyn Blackwood spent the week following the termination focused on the bond offering, which closed at a rate analysts characterized as favorable. She attended the closing dinner, delivered remarks about operational discipline and long-term stewardship, and returned to her office at 11 to find an automated ledger summary waiting in her inbox. The summary showed a 1-cent transfer into an account labeled Temporary Reconciliation Reserve, a line she did not recognize from the standard chart of accounts. She flagged it for Conrad's attention and asked for the account's authorization history. Conrad's response arrived the next morning. The account was a legacy clearing buffer established before her tenure, used to absorb minor rounding variances before they reached the consolidated report, and it had been reviewed and approved during the prior year's external audit. His tone was precise in the way that answered the surface question while declining to acknowledge what had prompted it, and something in that gap, the careful completeness of an explanation that had not been asked to go very deep, lodged in Evelyn's mind and remained there. She pulled Nolan's personnel file herself, without requesting a prepared summary, and read it from the first page to the last. 13 years, not one formal warning, not one procedural citation, and 3 documented instances in which he had identified material discrepancies that standard audit processes had missed, including a duplicate invoice stream from a European freight partner that had cost the company $11 million before Nolan caught it. She also noted that the access report Conrad had submitted to the Finance Committee, the report showing Nolan's login as the last to query the Coastal Bridge records, had been generated by Conrad's own office rather than by the IT Security Division, which was the department with exclusive authorization to produce official access documentation. Nolan and Reed had meanwhile moved methodically through every public quarterly filing Blackwood Meridian had submitted over the preceding 7 years, identifying vendor codes that matched the Coastal Bridge profile. Incorporated in low-disclosure jurisdictions, service categories tied to port logistics or cargo insurance, contracts initiated through direct approval processes that bypassed the standard procurement committee. They found 61 matching vendors. Each one had received payments ranging from thousands to millions of dollars. Each payment record closed with a 1-cent variance, and the aggregate total had already passed $200 million. Nolan reached out to Evelyn through a retired logistics attorney who had worked with both of them during a prior contract dispute and could serve as a neutral intermediary. Evelyn agreed to meet outside the company's communication infrastructure. They met in the reading room of a public library on the north side of the city, at a corner table with no cameras at the entrance and no institutional connection to any Blackwood Meridian affiliate. Evelyn arrived first. When Nolan opened a folder containing 18 months of transaction analysis and set it on the table between them, she examined the documents with the focused attention of someone who had spent years reading financial structures, and she understood immediately what she was looking at. She asked how long the program had been running. Nolan told her the earliest NDP code he could confirm dated back 7 years and 4 months, and that was only the earliest one he could verify. Evelyn listened to the full account of Needlepoint's architecture without interrupting. The program did not extract funds directly, it designated them. Each 1-cent marker flagged a corresponding transaction in a parallel ledger maintained outside the company's primary system, and those parallel transactions routed inflated payments to the network of shell vendors, where the amount above the legitimate service value was extracted and redistributed through a series of holding accounts. The mechanism worked because it exploited the gap between what the system was designed to track and what it was configured to report, and it had operated long enough that its artifacts had become part of the baseline that auditors used to define normal. Nolan pulled a profile on a vendor called Harbor Crown Freight. On paper, Harbor Crown was a mid-size regional carrier with 40 trucks and 3 warehouse facilities along the Gulf Coast. Its invoices were correctly formatted, its tax identification number was valid, and its payment history with Blackwood Meridian extended back 5 years. The warehouse addresses were real properties that appeared on mapping services with accurate street photographs. But when Nolan had driven past the nearest one the prior week, he had found a self-storage facility with no record of any freight company operating from the site during the period in question. Harbor Crown's registered agent address was a mail forwarding service in Delaware, sharing a suite number with 11 other entities, 7 of which appeared in Nolan's flagged vendor list. The company had received $38 million over 4 years, and the contract authorizing the relationship had been initiated through a direct approval memo signed by Conrad Whitmore, accompanied by a supporting recommendation from Graham Kingsley in his capacity as a board advisor on infrastructure development. Evelyn's expression when she reached Graham's name was carefully composed, but Nolan saw the pause before she turned the page and addressed it directly. The recommendation letter could have been solicited under false pretenses, and a board member's signature on an advisory memo did not establish that the signatory knew what the contract was funding. Evelyn said she understood the distinction. She said it with the careful evenness of someone who was not yet sure she believed it. They drove separately to a residential neighborhood in Evanston, where Miriam Holt had lived since her retirement. Miriam was 64 years old, clear-minded in the way of people who have spent decades professionally obligated to distrust easy explanations. And she received them with the guarded courtesy of someone who had been expecting this visit for some time without knowing when it would arrive. She had served as Blackwood Meridian's Director of Internal Audit for 11 years before being asked to retire at 61 on the stated grounds that her workload required reduction, a characterization she had disputed privately and accepted publicly because she understood that resisting it would make her departure considerably more difficult. The retirement had been proposed 3 weeks after she submitted a formal audit flag on a cluster of vendors that included Harbor Crown Freight. Conrad Whitmore had reviewed the flag, classified the matter as a resolved discrepancy, and filed a subsequent memo recommending her portfolio be reduced. 2 months later, she was gone. She went to her study and returned with a cloth-bound composition notebook. She had kept handwritten records of every vendor flag she had raised and every response she had received, names, dates, account numbers, her own notes on the sufficiency of each explanation. The notebook contained 27 vendors. When Nolan laid his printed analysis beside it, the overlap was exact. All 27 names appeared in his data. All 27 carried payment histories that closed with a 1-cent discrepancy. And at the bottom of the last page, in Miriam's careful script, was a note she had written to herself on the day before her retirement was formalized. Someone will find this eventually. Reed looked up from his laptop at the kitchen table and said that one of the 27 vendors had a pending payment queued in the Blackwood system. $94 million, scheduled to clear the following Friday. Nolan's immediate instinct was to block the transfer. His second, slower instinct was the right one. If they flagged the payment, every automated alert in the needlepoint architecture would fire simultaneously, and whoever was monitoring the network would have hours to erase the transaction history before any authority with preservation power could act. The program had survived more than 7 years because it had never been disturbed. The only way to capture the complete chain of custody, the funds, the accounts, the authorization codes, the identity of the person maintaining the system, was to let the transfer move while watching every node it passed through from a position the program could not detect. Reed built a passive monitoring framework using a read-only interface to the financial clearing database, designed to record the payment's path without generating write commands that Needlepoint's internal detection logic would register as surveillance. The framework took 14 hours to construct and test. When it was ready, Nolan told Evelyn what she needed to do and what she needed to appear to believe while doing it. Evelyn called Conrad on the Thursday afternoon before the Friday clearing window and told him she had reviewed the port rights acquisition and wanted to understand the strategic rationale before the payment processed. Conrad was warm and thorough in the way that people are when they believe they are managing a situation they have already controlled. He explained that the acquisition secured exclusive berthing rights at a privately operated Gulf facility, that the negotiation had been ongoing for 18 months, that the seller had imposed a tight closing window, and that announcing the deal alongside the quarterly results would be an ideal moment to reinforce market confidence in the company's infrastructure strategy. Evelyn said she would review the file over the weekend. Conrad said the payment needed to clear Friday, or the option expired. She thanked him for the briefing and ended the call. That Friday morning, from a laptop with no connection to any account associated with Nolan or Reed, Evelyn executed the authorization. Reed's framework recorded every second of what followed. The transfer split into 16 disbursements, 14 routed cleanly to the acquisition agreement's designated account, which was registered to a holding company with a verifiable principal and a documented asset portfolio. The remaining 2 were rerouted in a 40 millicant interval between authorization and confirmation, the same window Needlepoint had always used, with new destination codes substituted for the originals. The rerouted funds passed through 3 cargo insurance subsidiaries, then through an investment holding account registered in the Cayman Islands, and finally settled in an account bearing the name Kingsley Strategic Reserve. The total redirected was $11 million, consistent with the program's historical extraction rate of approximately 12%. The confirmation token posted to the company's internal ledger was a single 1-cent debit to the temporary reconciliation reserve. Nolan examined the authorization chain embedded in the rerouting commands and found that every redirect had been authenticated using a digital certificate issued to the office of the Chief Executive Officer of Blackwood Meridian. Evelyn's office, her organizational identity, attached to every command that moved the money sideways. He told her what he had found, and she absorbed it without visible reaction. Before they could locate the physical device, generating the authentication commands, Conrad convened an emergency board session and moved to suspend Evelyn from operational authority on the grounds that she had authorized unauthorized surveillance of the company's payment infrastructure. Evelyn walked into the building the following morning, knowing that Conrad had understood what had happened, and knowing that the next 48 hours would determine whether the evidence they had assembled was sufficient. The case Conrad presented to the board was efficient and largely credible to anyone who had not spent 3 weeks examining the underlying data. He submitted a security incident report alleging that Nolan Pierce had maintained unauthorized system access following his termination, had introduced a monitoring script disguised as a reconciliation query, and had used the resulting data to construct a false fraud allegation designed to destabilize the company's leadership ahead of a proxy contest. The access logs submitted with the report had been modified. Reed could see it in the metadata timestamps, which reflected edits made 4 days after the original records were generated. But the modifications were sophisticated enough to require forensic analysis to challenge, and forensic analysis required time that the board meeting did not provide. A wire transfer record had also been attached to the report, purporting to show that Nolan had accepted a payment from the consulting firm that had offered him $500,000. A payment he had never acknowledged and had never received, and whose documentation he suspected had been manufactured to suggest he was an interested party rather than an independent witness. Evelyn sat at the board table and said nothing during Conrad's presentation, having been advised by her own counsel to limit her statements until the independent audit committee could be formally constituted. And she honored that advice even as she watched the room's collective judgment tilt incrementally toward Conrad's account. Graham Kingsley, seated at the far end of the table, had been quiet through most of the session. When he finally spoke, it was not to support Conrad's motion, but to request a recess. He met Evelyn in the corridor outside the boardroom and spoke quickly and without elaboration. The account bearing his family's name had not been authorized by him or by anyone with legitimate access to the Kingsley family's financial infrastructure. His attorneys had confirmed the account had been opened using forged incorporation documents that carried his family's name without any knowledge or consent on his part, and he had retained independent counsel 3 days earlier when he first saw the account name in a document Conrad had circulated. He also told her that Conrad had taken a significant short position in Blackwood Meridian stock through a Cayman-based fund, a position established 14 months earlier that would generate a return of several $100 million if the company's share price fell below a specific threshold in the next 6 weeks. Graham handed her a folder and walked back into the room. Meanwhile, Nolan had been reviewing the printout he had carried out of the building on the day of his termination and had found a secondary structure in the NDP codes that he had missed during the initial analysis. The sequential numbers embedded in the codes also contained, in their final 4 digits, a running total of completed extraction cycles. The code on his page corresponded to cycle 18,312. Miriam worked through the per-cycle averages using her notebook figures and the aggregate data Nolan had documented, and the total converged on a number she wrote at the bottom of a fresh sheet and then pushed across the table without speaking. $703,418,206.17. The 17 cents at the end of that figure were the accumulated confirmation tokens from 17 extraction cycles where needlepoint had left its marker and no one had come to retrieve it. The number was specific enough and documented enough to serve as the foundation for a formal referral, but it was not yet attributable to a named individual because the authorization chain still pointed to Evelyn's credentials. To close that gap, Nolan needed to make needlepoint identify its controller in real time, in front of witnesses who could not later claim the demonstration had been staged. The test Nolan designed was straightforward. Initiate a 1-cent internal transfer between 2 dormant clearing accounts that were technically still active in the system but had processed no transactions in over 2 years. Under normal operating conditions, the transfer would fail validation. The accounts were flagged as inactive, and the amount fell below the minimum transaction threshold by a factor of several thousand. But needlepoint had been built to intercept the 1-cent signal precisely because it was anomalous. No legitimate transaction ever moved exactly 1 cent outside a rounding context, which meant any solitary 1-cent entry was by definition a program-generated marker, and the program was designed to recognize and respond to its own signal. If needlepoint was running, it would receive the transfer, generate a new NDP code, open a temporary holding account, attempt to link to the shell vendor network, and dispatch an authentication request to the device registered as the primary authorization token for the Office of the Chief Executive. The response to that request would carry a hardware signature identifying the specific physical machine that had generated the authentication, and that machine would be the controller. Evelyn requested a special audit committee session under her authority as the sitting CEO, framing it as a governance review preceding any vote on her suspension. Conrad arrived with his legal team and 2 external auditors he had retained independently. The room was full, which was precisely what Nolan needed. He entered as a witness called by the Independent Audit Committee, a procedural right that Graham Kingsley, invoking his authority as a major shareholder, had formally secured over Conrad's objection. Conrad told the committee that Nolan's presence was irregular and potentially unlawful given the outstanding security allegations. Graham told the committee that those allegations had originated from Conrad's office, and that the committee's independence required it to hear contrary evidence before making any ruling. The committee chair, a retired federal judge who had occupied the position for 6 years, and had developed an immunity to procedural pressure tactics from any direction, allowed Nolan to proceed. Nolan did not attempt to narrate the entire investigation. He had 3 minutes before Conrad's attorneys would move to restrict his testimony, and he used all 3 on a single demonstration. He asked Evelyn to execute a transfer of 1 cent from account 774-A to account 774-B. 2 legacy clearing accounts accessible from the laptop in front of her, a machine that had never been assigned to Nolan and carried no connection to any device he had used. Evelyn entered the transfer. In the 11 seconds that followed, Needlepoint generated a new NDP code, created a temporary holding account registered under a fabricated vendor name, established links to 4 of the 27 companies in Miriam's notebook, and dispatched an authentication request to the device registered as the primary authorization token for the office of the chief executive. A notification appeared on a device sitting face down on the conference table. It appeared on the phone in front of Conrad Whitmore. Conrad said it was an automated system alert and that he received dozens daily. Nolan asked him to set the phone face down and not touch the screen. He explained to the committee that if Conrad did not provide the authentication response within 90 seconds, the transfer would cancel and leave no permanent record. But if the authentication came from any registered device, it would be logged with a hardware signature that could be matched to a specific machine. Conrad did not touch his phone. At 81 seconds, the authentication processed on its own, generated by a remote device that read, monitoring from a laptop in the corridor outside the room, immediately traced to an IP address within the building, specifically within a storage room on the 32nd floor, directly behind the suite designated as the CEO's private office. The response had come from a machine not listed on the company's official asset registry. Every person in the room understood what that meant, and the silence that followed was the kind that settles over a space when something long hidden has just been found in plain sight. Conrad moved immediately, with the speed of someone who had prepared for this possibility. He told the committee that the device in the storage room had been installed by Evelyn's own IT liaison during the office build-out that accompanied her appointment, that the digital certificate registered to the office of the chief executive had been generated at her direction and activated under her authority, and that every contract authorization in the Needlepoint chain bore her organizational signature because she had built the system and operated it. The digital certificates were real. The organizational signatures were real. The chain of authority had been constructed with meticulous precision, and it had been constructed to terminate at exactly one name, the one person in the organization whose reputational destruction would trigger the outcome Conrad required: a confidence collapse, a leadership vacuum, and the company's core assets available for acquisition at distressed prices. Nolan requested access to the certificate's creation record. Not the authorization record showing Evelyn's name, but the technical creation log showing the workstation identity and operator account that had actually generated the cryptographic key pair. The committee chair approved the request. Reed pulled the record remotely within minutes. The certificate had been generated from a workstation assigned to the CFO's technology liaison, a position reporting directly to Conrad's office. On the same afternoon, Evelyn had been formally appointed CEO. The creation timestamp was 4 hours before her appointment was publicly announced, which meant the certificate had been created before she possessed the access credentials that would have allowed her to request it. Someone had manufactured a digital identity for her office before she occupied that office, and had spent 7 years attaching a network of liability to a name that had not yet learned it was being used. Reed located the physical machine in the storage room within 20 minutes of the session ending. It was a laptop from a discontinued product line connected to the building's internal network through a maintenance port that appeared in no current infrastructure diagram, with a serial number tracing to a procurement batch managed by a technology consulting firm whose principal client list included 2 entities from the Whitmore family's financial holdings. Miriam matched the procurement date to her records and found that the delivery had occurred during the same quarter she had submitted her audit flag on Harbor Crown Freight, the flag that had led to her retirement 3 months later. Confronted with the device record, the procurement history, and the certificate creation timestamp, Conrad took a position the committee found insufficient. He said he had been operating under instructions from Graham Kingsley that the Shell vendor network had served the interests of the Kingsley family's infrastructure investments, and that his own role had been operational rather than conceptual. Graham set a folder of bank records on the table without standing. The records showed that the accounts receiving the extracted funds had been established in the name of entities controlled by the Whitmore family's trust network. Of the $703 million Miriam had calculated, the recoverable portion, funds still held in intermediate accounts rather than deployed into hard assets, was $412 million. The balance had been converted into real estate, port infrastructure, and insurance subsidiaries over 7 years, each acquisition timed to follow a period of elevated extraction. Conrad's plan had been measured in years and designed in layers. Drain the company steadily, conceal the loss behind a fabricated identity for the CEO, trigger a confidence crisis that would collapse the share price, and use the Whitmore family's accumulated capital, partly derived from the theft itself, to acquire the company's best assets in the restructuring that would follow. When security personnel escorted Conrad from the conference room, he paused at the door and looked across the table at Nolan and asked how he had seen what thousands of professionals had missed for 7 years. Nolan told him, because Conrad had believed a penny was too small to be worth protecting. The formal investigation ran for 9 months. Federal financial regulators and independent forensic auditors confirmed the total amount extracted from Blackwood Meridian at $703,418,206. The precise figure Miriam had calculated at her kitchen table with a composition notebook and a 13-year-old stack of flagged vendor files. Approximately $400 million was recovered through asset freezes and cross-border cooperation with the jurisdictions where the intermediate accounts had been maintained. The remaining amount was pursued through civil proceedings against the Whitmore Family Trust Network, a process expected to extend over several years. Conrad Whitmore was indicted on 31 counts. The technology liaison who had created the fraudulent certificate cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. 3 Finance Committee members who had seconded the termination motion were investigated for their roles in suppressing the audit inquiry. 2 were cleared. The 3rd resigned before the investigation concluded. Evelyn Blackwood stood before the full board 30 days after Conrad's arrest, and accepted responsibility for the termination of Nolan Pierce without adequate investigation. She did not attribute blame to the committee members who had voted with Conrad, did not invoke the bond offering pressure, and did not reference the fabricated access report that had been placed in her hands to make her doubt him. She said she had been shown a document designed to make her distrust a man she should have trusted, and she had permitted a deadline to override her judgment, and neither of those facts diminished the harm done to him or the damage sustained by the company. The board reaffirmed her authority. She offered Nolan the position of Global Audit Director with a compensation package proportionate to what the company now understood him to be capable of. He declined the title. He offered instead a set of structural conditions, an internal audit division reporting directly to the board rather than to the CFO, written protection for any employee who identified a financial discrepancy regardless of the amount, a mandatory review protocol for any variance flagged by staff regardless of materiality threshold, and a formal policy requiring that the person who identified an anomaly be interviewed and protected before any disciplinary action related to that anomaly could proceed. Evelyn presented all 4 conditions to the board that afternoon, and all 4 were adopted before the close of business. She asked Nolan to serve as the founding director of the new division and to build it according to whatever standards he considered necessary. Lena came to the new office on the morning Nolan moved in, carrying a small frame she had made from a piece of scrap wood she had found in the garage. Inside it, behind a square of glass, she had mounted a single old coin, and on a strip of paper beneath it she had written in her own careful hand, "The smallest thing in the room may carry the largest truth." Nolan set the frame on the corner of his desk where he could see it without turning his chair. He kept the cardboard box from the day of his termination under the desk, still folded flat, not as a wound he nursed, but as a record of a moment he considered worth preserving, the way certain days deserve a witness even after they have ended. On the first morning the new division opened for intake, a young analyst knocked on the open door and said, in the hesitant voice of someone unsure whether what she had found was worth the interruption, that she had noticed a 2-cent discrepancy in the prior week's consolidated report. The room went quiet, and everyone waited to see what the man who had once been fired over a single penny would do with a number that was already twice as large. Nolan pulled a second chair to the side of his desk, set it beside his own, and told her to sit down, because a number that refused to disappear quietly was always the beginning of something worth understanding, and the smallest variance in a room full of millions was exactly where the truth had always been waiting.